Kick things off. It is 12:05. I'm Coach Kieran DiOrio. Welcome to Point A and welcome to 12:05 Live. I help high-performing professionals accelerate their family happiness without sacrificing their business success. Today, the first installment of Ending Endless Overwhelm. I'll share the first step, which is awareness. Two key points there. And then I'm going to touch on the superpower that we all have that we must tap into if we're ever to get a handle on overwhelm. And this is your superpower of saying no, the different flavors it comes in, why we say no, and what it actually does for us. Again, time permitting here. So as always, your questions, your comments, your thoughts, always welcome. Just pop them in the chat, and if I can address them immediately, I will do so. If not, I'll get back to you via email after today's show. And hey, sometimes the questions give us material that's better than the stuff I prepare, so please don't be shy. All right, so let's begin. Okay, first step in dealing with endless overwhelm is this awareness. Let's talk about it. Two key points here. If you had a chance to review the primer video I did earlier in this week, take a peek at it if you didn't. But I talk about the importance of awareness, not necessarily you being aware that you are in fact overwhelmed. I'm sure you're very aware of that when that comes up, but rather an awareness of what's really going on, what's really coming up for you, who you are being when you get overwhelmed. In that video, I share that humans tend to go to some of our weakest modes of operation, our lowest energies when we get overwhelmed. And this is going to cue a lot of different things. Emotions come up like worry, guilt, fear, powerlessness, anger, right? That's what comes up often when we get overwhelmed. And that's going to translate into a lot of different behaviors. Behaviors of avoidance, that's a big one when we get overwhelmed. Very common that we have so much going on that we tend to avoid addressing things because there's just so much to address. We're overwhelmed. We're washed overboard, right? Other behaviors, maybe conflict. Sometimes we choose to fight our way out of periods of overwhelm, and that can take many, many forms. But that might be something that comes up behaviorally when we get overwhelmed. And often disengagement. Overwhelm. To put simply, it feels really bad. Obviously, we have emotions of guilt, worry, fear coming up. It feels terrible. And a lot of times emotionally, we'll disengage. It feels so bad for so long, especially when we're in a place of chronic overwhelm, that we might go a little bit numb in order to protect ourselves a little bit. So that'd be a typical behavior that comes up when we get overwhelmed. And just remember, this is all very normal, very common, absolutely understandable. These are very, very much our go-to responses when we get overwhelmed. But the important thing to remember here, what we have to be aware of is because we go to our weak spots, because we go to our lowest energies, we engage in our lowest potential plays when we get overwhelmed, it's very easy to get stuck in chronic or endless overwhelm, right? Think of it this way. If we're trying to elevate out of something with the weakest possible platform, it's going to be very hard to do that. If we're trying to dig our way out of overwhelm using our lowest quality tools, we're probably not going to be that successful, and hence we're going to get stuck there, right? And it's so important to understand this because the world is going to give us myriad opportunities to become overwhelmed. It's never going to stop unless we get a handle on things. And it's this risk is why it's so important for us to be aware of what's really going on and who we are actually being when we get overwhelmed. I hope that makes sense. I actually have a question coming up in the chat, and it's a good one, so I'm going to go to it. The question is, what do you mean by weak spots? And I talked about where we go energetically. We tend to feel powerless. We have emotions of fear, worry. We engage in certain behaviors like avoidance and disengagement or even conflict, for example. But I'll give you a couple examples. I think that's how this stuff is best understood. As a personal example, I was overwhelmed this weekend, and we'll talk more about this, but I was overwhelmed for some good reasons. And in my overwhelm, I was focusing on some other things, and I was cruising through some communications, and there was one that I just gave a cursory glance because I was in a task kind of mode because I was overwhelmed in some other ways. I was really thinking in a binary way, like, I either look at this and do something about it now, or if I judge it to be something that can be postponed. I'll do it later. And that's what I did. I did the latter. And in my haste, in that overwhelm, I missed a crucial communication about someone that I really care about in my family. And I have felt like so guilty and so um, daft about that. Really bothered me. I've been angry with myself for a couple of days about it. And that's been affecting how I've been performing all week. So that's an example of getting into a state of overwhelm, operating in a certain way, making a mistake, which is normal. This is what humans do. But the impact of that mistake is something that's been really affecting my performance and my success and my enjoyment for the past couple of days. So that would be an example of going to a weak spot, the weak spot creating an even bigger issue, and then that wrapping back into a repeating loop of being overwhelmed. I haven't been as effective this week because of that. Another example would be disengagement. Being overwhelmed, the feelings of worry or fear, for example, it feels bad. It just feels bad. And oftentimes, to protect ourselves, we might disengage emotionally. We might go a little numb in order to protect ourselves from that feeling and be able to operate in this world which is so demanding. And again, that's normal and natural. But if we are disengaging, we're going to miss opportunities. I've got a lot of clients that are so busy, they'll get so overwhelmed, and they'll miss a big emotional cue with a member of the family, one of the kids or whatever, and it has big impact for them. So that's an example of a behavior going to a weak spot under a point of overwhelm, and it really compounding the issues and the issue of overwhelm itself. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that's helpful. But let me get on to our next couple slides here. I want to get as much as we can in the time allotted. So I talked about that first point of awareness, who we're being when we're overwhelmed. What's the second point? And maybe it's a little bit of good news. Overwhelm is very much a sign of life, right? Especially high performance or high potential life. If we're out there working on our businesses, raising our families, engaging with our social network, partnering with our spouse or partner, staying physically fit, enjoying life, the list goes on and on. Of course, we're going to become overwhelmed, right? As I said earlier, we can be overwhelmed by bad things. We can be overwhelmed by good things. And of course, we can handle it, and we can even get dividends from periods of overwhelm if we have the reserves we need to address the natural periods of overwhelm that come with a high performance life. Let me repeat that. We must have a reserve in place in order to address natural periods of overwhelm, right? Think of it like this. Overwhelm, maybe it should be like catching a cold. It's absolutely a part of life. The symptoms are really unpleasant. It can be draining, but it is temporary, right? And if we have reserves in place to deal with overwhelm, we can absolutely deal with it. In fact, we can gain from periods of overwhelm. That said, endless overwhelm, routine panic, chronic soul crush, these require us to expend all of our reserves all the time. It makes us very difficult to be successful. Just like having a wicked cold all month or all quarter or all year, it's going to be very, very hard for us to not only feel good or feel fulfilled, but actually be successful in any way, shape, or form when we're in that period of chronic overwhelm. So that's the second point of awareness. So we've got this awareness, who we're being when we're overwhelmed. We know that overwhelm is a natural part of life, and maybe we could even welcome it as a natural part of a high performance life. But we know that the endless variety of overwhelm is what we have to really address. So how do we do it? There's so much information out there on overwhelm, a lot of peripheral stuff out there and accessories and apps and all the stuff. And whether it's time management or whatever you want to talk about, ultimately, this all goes to us using the superpower of us being able to say no. And I wish I could jazz it up or use bigger words, but it really is this simple. And I'm not saying it's easy at all, but I'm saying it is this simple. Now, no comes in many flavors. Here are my favorites in order of power. most powerful being first. We've got no, not me, and we have no, not now. And I'm coming up on about 12 minutes here, so I'm going to leave us just at this point in time talking about these 3 flavors of no. Let me remind you that all these flavors of no have a flip side with a yes behind it. Okay, we'll talk more about that next week when we get into some detail. But let me just leave you with that, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Remember, let's just maintain that awareness in terms of who we're being under overwhelm. Know that it's normal and natural to get overwhelmed. Let's set the intention of overwhelm being more like getting a cold a few times a year, or whatever it's appropriate for us, rather than living in that state of overwhelm. Endless overwhelm, right? Rather than being like a cold, it's like having a terminal disease. It's that serious. So hey, I'll wrap it up with that. Again, I'm Coach Kieran DiOrio. I help high performers accelerate family happiness without sacrificing business success. So if you want your happiness to finally catch up with all that success on the business side, give me a call, 724-331-9263, or look me up at pointacoachingandconsulting.com. And thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.